She buried her brother on a Tuesday. By Thursday, his enemy was standing in her parlor. Geraldine Eagan had nothing left. The house was being stripped bare. The creditors had already come once, and they were coming again in the morning. Her brother was gone. The money was gone. And the future she had spent years quietly holding together had simply collapsed the moment he stopped breathing. So when Lord Dunning walked through her door, she expected cruelty. She expected gloating. This was the man her brother had faced in courtrooms for 6 years. The man every newspaper in London described as cold, ruthless, and impossible to beat. Instead, he set a contract on the table and offered her a job. Not charity, not pity, a salary, a real position, managing his estate in Derbyshire. He told her she owed him nothing except hard work. Then he picked up 2 heavy boxes of her brother's law books, carried them down the stairs himself, and left without waiting to be thanked. Geraldine told herself she was only saying yes because she had no other choice. She was wrong about that. But she would not understand why until much later. Because what Geraldine did not know, as she packed her bags and prepared to start over inside a stranger's house, was that someone at Thornfield was already watching her arrive, already planning, already holding a letter that could have changed everything, locked away in a desk drawer where Geraldine would never think to look. And by the time she found out about that letter, she would be standing in the entrance hall in the dark, her coat on, her trunk at her feet, and 1 foot already out the door. Lord Dunning did not knock like a man who expected to be turned away. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, certain, the kind of knock that assumed the door would open, because doors always opened for men like him. Geraldine answered it herself. The housemaid had been let go that morning, along with the cook and the boy who polished the silver. There was no silver left to polish anyway. She opened the door and found him exactly as she had expected. Tall, immaculately dressed, his expression revealing nothing. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked as though it had not decided yet whether it was handsome or merely severe. His eyes moved across her once, quickly, the way a man reads a document he has already been briefed on. "Miss Eagan," he said, not a question. "Lord Dunning," she said, also not a question. He stepped inside without being invited. She let him, because the hallway behind her was already half empty, and there was very little left worth protecting. He set the contract on the dining room table. The table was still there. The creditors were coming back for it Thursday. Geraldine sat down and read every line. She was not a woman who signed things she had not read, regardless of circumstance. Dunning stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the gray London street and said nothing while she read. He did not tap his foot. He did not check his watch. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that silence was its own form of pressure. She reached the final clause. A fair salary, full authority over household and tenant accounts, accommodation provided. Ya's position to begin within the week. "You knew my brother for 6 years, she said without looking up. "You never once spoke to me." "No," Dunning said. "Then why now?" He turned from the window. "Because he asked me to." Geraldine looked up at that. She studied his face for the lie and did not find one. That was almost more unsettling than if she had. "He asked his enemy to look after his sister," she said slowly. "He asked the person he trusted most," Dunning replied. Then, before she could answer that, he picked up 2 heavy crates of her brother's law books from the corner of the room, carried them out to his waiting carriage, and returned without a word. He did not ask where she wanted them. He did not explain himself. He simply moved them, the way a man does when he has decided a thing needs doing. Geraldine picked up the pen and signed. She told herself it was the creditors. She told herself it was the empty coal scuttle and the coming Thursday, and the very real possibility of having nowhere to sleep by the weekend. She told herself a great many sensible and practical things. She was still telling herself those things 2 days later, when the Thornfield carriage rolled up a long gravel drive between bare winter trees and stopped in front of a house so large and so still that it felt less like a home and more like a held breath. The entrance hall was immaculate. Dark wood floors, high ceilings, a staircase that curved upward like something from a different world entirely. The staff stood in a neat line. Geraldine moved down it with her chin level, cataloging faces, filing names. And at the end of the line, not a servant at all, stood a woman in deep blue silk who smiled at Geraldine as though she had been expecting her for years and had already decided what to do about her. "My dear Miss Eagan." The woman's voice was warm and smooth and utterly without heat. "I am Patricia, Lord Dunning's cousin. We are so very pleased to have you." She pressed Geraldine's hand briefly. Her fingers were cold. Geraldine smiled back with precisely the same amount of warmth and filed that away too. It was Dorothy, the housekeeper, a solid, quiet woman of perhaps 55, who showed Geraldine to her rooms without ceremony or commentary. And it was Dorothy who appeared 20 minutes later with a tray of tea and a small plate of shortbread, setting it on the desk beside the window without being asked, without making a performance of it. The ledgers are already on your desk," Dorothy said. "Lord Dunning had them brought up this morning." Geraldine looked at the neatly stacked books and felt, for just a moment, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being expected. Not merely tolerated, expected. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words could carry. Dorothy nodded once and moved toward the door. Then she stopped. Geraldine had already opened the first ledger. Something was missing. She turned through the pages again, checking the sequence: household accounts, tenant records, farm revenues. But the one book that should have sat between the farm revenues and the household expenditure was not there. "Dorothy," she said, "there is an account book missing." The housekeeper's hand rested on the doorframe for just a beat too long. "Lady Patricia handles that one herself," she said carefully. Then she left. Geraldine sat alone in the quiet room and looked at the numbers in front of her. She was very good with numbers. She had been balancing her brother's books since she was 19 years old, catching his mistakes, correcting his overestimates, quietly keeping disaster at a distance while he stood in courtrooms and received all the applause. The numbers in these ledgers did not quite fit together. Not dramatically, not obviously, but they did not fit. She closed the book. She told herself it was nothing, a filing inconsistency, an administrative quirk. There were perfectly reasonable explanations for a missing account book, and she would find one in the morning. She poured her tea and watched the last light fade over the Derbyshire hills. And somewhere on the other side of this enormous, silent house, in a room Geraldine had not yet been shown, Patricia sat at her writing desk and did not sleep at all. The first argument happened on her 4th day at Thornfield. Geraldine had spent 3 days reading through the tenant agreements, all of them, from the oldest lease to the most recent renewal. And by the 3rd evening, she had covered 6 pages of her own notepaper with observations that were too precise to be called concerns and too damning to be called anything else. She knocked on the door of Dunning's study at 9:30 in the morning and placed her notes on his desk without preamble. He read them without expression. She stood across from him and waited. "You believe the Northern Field rents have not been reviewed in 11 years, he said. I do not believe it. I have confirmed it. He turned the page. You are recommending reductions for 6 tenants. 4 reductions and 2 exemptions. Harding's land flooded twice last season. He has been paying full rent on fields that cannot be farmed." Dunning set the notes down. He looked at her across the desk with the same expression he had worn in her parlor in London, measuring, unhurried, revealing nothing. "These changes will cost the estate income," he said. "In the short term," Geraldine replied. "In the long term, a tenant who is treated fairly does not leave. A tenant who leaves costs considerably more to replace than the difference in rent." A silence stretched between them. Then Dunning picked up his pen and made a mark at the top of her first page. "I will have Thompson draft the revisions," he said, and returned to his own correspondence. That was all. No acknowledgement, no argument, no indication that she had just altered 11 years of estate policy in the space of 4 minutes. Geraldine walked back to her own desk and decided, carefully and deliberately, not to find that satisfying. She was only partially successful. The weeks that followed built a rhythm she had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. Every morning she reviewed the accounts. Every afternoon she brought Dunning whatever required his attention, and whatever required hers, she handled herself. They argued regularly about drainage contracts, about a boundary dispute with the neighboring Ashby estate, about the appropriate response to a tenant who had sublet his cottage without permission. Dunning was never wrong about matters of law. Geraldine was never wrong about matters of people. They had discovered, without discussing it, that between the two of them most problems could be solved. It was efficient. That was what it was. Patricia did not see it that way. It began small enough that Geraldine almost missed it. A dinner invitation from a local family that arrived for Geraldine 2 days after the event had already taken place. A letter from the Thornfield linen supplier addressed to Lady Patricia instead of to Geraldine, who had been the one to place the order. A seating arrangement at the first formal dinner of the season that placed Geraldine firmly at the lower end of the table, between the estate solicitor's clerk and a young man who had very strong opinions about crop rotation and no opinions about anything else. Geraldine noted all of it. She said nothing. But Dunning noticed too. She knew because halfway through that dinner, without looking up from his conversation with the man on his left, he reached across the table and moved her place card, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply picked it up and set it 2 seats closer and went back to his conversation as though nothing had happened. Patricia's smile from the far end of the table did not flicker, but her eyes did. Dorothy saw that too. And then something changed. It was subtle at first, a document appearing on Geraldine's desk that had nothing to do with household accounts. A letter of negotiation from a difficult landowner to the south who had been disputing water rights for 3 seasons. A note from Dunning in the margin, 3 words only. "Your thoughts, please." No explanation, no context. She provided 6 pages of analysis by the following morning. He implemented her recommendations by the end of the week. Then a second document, then a third. Each one a little further outside the strict boundaries of her original position, each one accompanied by the same quiet expectation, the same absence of explanation. He simply handed them to her, the way a man hands something to the only person he trusts to handle it correctly. Geraldine told herself it was practical. She was there. She was available. She understood the estate. That was all. She was still telling herself that, on the night they worked until past 11 on the Harding case, a tenant dispute that had grown complicated enough to require a formal response to the county magistrate. The fire had burned low. The rest of the house was silent. Geraldine was copying the final draft in her clearest hand when Dunning set down his pen and was quiet for a moment. "Your brother once told me," he said, without looking up, "that the most dangerous person in any negotiation was the one everyone underestimated." He paused. He was talking about himself. Geraldine kept her pen moving. He usually was. Then Dunning looked up, and his eyes met hers across the desk. "He was wrong," he said simply. He stood, picked up his coat from the back of the chair, and left the room before she could find a single word to say in response. Geraldine sat alone in the fire-lit study for a long time. Outside, the Derbyshire wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, she stared at the half-finished page and understood, with quiet and unwelcome clarity, saw that she was in considerably more danger than she had accounted for. Not from Dunning, from herself. She was still sitting there, very still, turning that thought over in her mind, when on the floor above her, Patricia unlocked the top drawer of her writing desk and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. It was addressed, in a formal Edinburgh hand, to Miss Geraldine Eagan. Patricia opened it. She read it once, twice. Her expression did not change. Then she folded it carefully back along its original creases, placed it inside the drawer, and turned the key. The quarterly estate meeting was held in the long dining room on the first Friday of February. All of Thornfield's staff attended, the groundskeepers and the stable hands, the parlor maids and the kitchen girls, and the footmen who stood too straight, and the older men who had worked the land since before Dunning was born. They filled the room in a quiet, orderly line, and Dunning stood at the head of the table and moved through the agenda the way he moved through everything, directly, without decoration, with the clear expectation that his words would be heard once and acted upon immediately. Patricia sat to one side with Melissa beside her, both of them perfectly arranged, as though they had been painted into the scene. Dorothy stood near the door with her hands folded and her face composed. Geraldine stood slightly apart, as she always did at these gatherings, present, attentive, occupying her position without making a performance of it. Dunning worked through the winter maintenance reports, the drainage work on the East Field, the renewal of the blacksmith's contract, a staffing change in the stables, each item delivered in the same even tone, requiring nothing from the room except attention. Then he paused, turned one page, and said, "Miss Eagan holds my authority over all tenant correspondence, estate account decisions, and household procurement from this point forward. Queries that would previously have come to me in those areas will go to her. Her decisions are final." He turned the next page. That was all. No explanation, no context, no invitation for questions or comments. He said it the way he might announce a change in the schedule for the winter coal delivery, with the complete and unhurried certainty of a man who had already considered the matter thoroughly and found it unremarkable. The room absorbed it in silence. Dorothy's eyes dropped briefly to the floor. When she raised them again, they were very steady. Patricia's smile remained exactly in place. Not a muscle moved, not a single flicker. She was too practiced for that. But beside her, Melissa's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap, and Geraldine, who noticed things, noticed that too. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Staff dispersed. The room emptied with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that they had witnessed something significant and had the good sense not to say so. Geraldine returned to her desk. She worked through the morning without interruption. She told herself the declaration had been administrative, a practical clarification of reporting lines. She told herself this with great conviction and moderate success. It was just past 3 in the afternoon when she went to the library to retrieve a copy of the Ashby Boundary Survey, and found Dunning already there. He was standing at the far window with a book open in his hand, though he did not appear to be reading it. He looked up when she entered. "I will only be a moment," she said. "The survey map." "I know where it is." He crossed the room, found the correct drawer in the map cabinet without hesitation, and placed the rolled document on the table. Then he did not leave. Geraldine unrolled the survey. She could feel him still standing there, 3 feet away, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to say something and is choosing the precise moment. "There is something I should have told you sooner," he said. She kept her eyes on the map. "Yes?" "Your brother spoke to me at length during his final 2 days." A pause. He was not a man who said unnecessary things when he was well. He said a great many of them when he was dying. Geraldine set her hands flat on the table. "He told me that you were the most capable person he had ever known." Dunning's voice was even, careful, as though he were reading from a prepared statement. "He told me that he had spent years standing in rooms and receiving credit for work that was largely yours. That you had kept his career intact, his accounts solvent, and his household functioning through circumstances that would have defeated most people." Another pause. "He said he was deeply ashamed that he had never told you so himself." The library was very quiet. Outside, a bird moved through the bare branches of the elm tree beside the window. Inside, neither of them spoke. "He never told me that," Geraldine said. Her voice was composed. Her hands were perfectly still on the table. "No," Dunning replied. "He told me instead." A brief silence. "I thought you should have it." He picked up his book from where he had set it down, walked to the door, and left. Geraldine did not move for a long time. The survey map lay open in front of her, unread. Late afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. She thought about her brother in his final hours, finding the honesty he had never managed while he was well enough to deliver it himself. She thought about the years of quiet work, the invisible effort, the patience she had worn like a second skin. For so long she had almost forgotten it was not her real one. She did not cry. She sat in the stillness and let the words settle into her, like something long owed finally being paid. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Geraldine Eagan thought, carefully, reluctantly, and with full awareness of how dangerous the thought was, that she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. She was still sitting there when the library clock read 5:30. She was still sitting there when, on the other side of the house, Patricia settled at her writing desk, uncapped her pen, and drew a sheet of Thornfield stationery from the top of the stack. She wrote the date. She wrote the address of a legal firm in Edinburgh. She wrote 3 careful paragraphs, declining a position of employment on behalf of Miss Geraldine Eagan, suggesting a change in personal circumstances and expressing gratitude for the firm's consideration. Then she practiced the signature twice on a separate sheet of paper, tore that sheet into 4 pieces, and dropped them into the fire. On the 3rd attempt, she signed Geraldine's name. She folded the letter, sealed it, and set it on the corner of the desk for the Morning Post. In the corridor outside, Dorothy was passing with a candle on her way to check the upstairs lamps. She slowed as she reached Patricia's door. Through the gap, she saw Patricia hand the sealed envelope to Walker, who appeared at the far end of the hall with his coat already on. "Outgoing correspondence," Patricia said. "See that it goes with tomorrow's post." Walker took it and left. Patricia closed her door. Dorothy stood in the corridor for a moment, shimmering candle in hand, looking at the closed door and the empty space where the boy had been standing. Then she continued down the hall, her face unreadable, filing it away in the careful and patient place in her mind where she kept the things she was not yet ready to say. She heard it on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the library. Geraldine had come upstairs to retrieve a file from her room, a boundary document she needed for the Ashby correspondence, and was halfway along the upper gallery when the voices below stopped her. The sitting room doors were open. She could not see in from where she stood, but she could hear clearly. Patricia's voice carried the way it always did when she believed herself to be alone, unhurried, assured, not bothering to keep itself quiet. Men like Dunning do not keep experiments indefinitely. Geraldine went still. He finds her useful at present. These things have a season. When the novelty passes, the situation will correct itself. A softer murmur. Melissa, asking something. A woman in her position does not become permanent, Patricia continued. She becomes a lesson. A brief lapse in judgment that a man of his standing quietly puts right. It happens more often than people admit. Another murmur from Melissa. Something that might have been disagreement, or discomfort, or both. It is not unkind to say so, Patricia said. It is simply the truth. Geraldine stood at the railing for a long moment. She looked down at her hands on the banister. Then she turned, walked back to her room, and closed the door. She did not slam it. She closed it with the same quiet control she had applied to every door in every house she had ever been unwelcome in, which was most of them. She sat at her desk. She thought about Patricia's voice, the absolute certainty in it, the absence of malice. That was the part that settled in her chest like cold water, not cruelty, certainty. Patricia had not said those things to wound anyone. She had said them because she believed them to be obvious. And the terrible thing, the thing Geraldine sat with in the failing afternoon light, was that she recognized them. She had thought versions of those same words herself, late at night, when the house was quiet and she was honest enough to stop pretending otherwise. She pulled out a sheet of paper. She wrote the resignation letter in 3 paragraphs. And it was the cleanest thing she had ever written, clear, professional, entirely correct in every formal detail. She thanked Dunning for the opportunity. She cited personal reasons. She offered to remain available for a brief handover period should it be required. She signed her name. She read it once. Then she folded it, addressed it, and placed it face down on the corner of the desk. She opened her trunk. She had not unpacked everything when she arrived. She had told herself at the time that it was practical. No point settling too deeply into borrowed spaces. Now she understood it had been instinct. The instinct of someone who had learned repeatedly that comfort was temporary and the trunk was always going to come back out eventually. She worked methodically, dresses folded, books stacked, and papers sorted into their correct order and wrapped in cloth. She was not hurried. She was not distressed. She was simply efficient, in the way she had always been efficient, clearing up a space she had occupied so that the next person would find it, just as they left it. The clock on the mantelpiece read 10:30 when the light knock came, or rather, when the door opened without one. Dorothy stood in the doorway. Her candle was still in her hand. Her eyes went to the trunk, to the neat pile of folded clothes on the bed, to the addressed envelope on the corner of the desk, and then to Geraldine. She did not look surprised. That, somehow, was the hardest part. "Miss Eagan." Her voice was low and careful. "There is something you need to know." "There is nothing," Geraldine said quietly. That would change this." Dorothy was silent for a moment. She looked at the trunk again. Then she looked at Geraldine with an expression that held several things at once: sorrow and hesitation, and the particular tension of someone carrying a weight they have not yet decided how to set down. Then she pulled the door closed and left. Geraldine listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. She sat on the edge of the bed beside the folded clothes, and she was very still, and she did not allow herself to think about the library or the survey map or a man handing her 2 crates of books without waiting to be thanked. She finished packing at 4:30 in the morning. The house had been silent for hours. She lifted her coat from the hook behind the door, put it on, and picked up the resignation letter. The corridor was dark. She moved through it by memory, down the main staircase, across the entrance hall, to the closed door of Dunning's study. She crouched down and slid the envelope carefully beneath it. She heard it whisper across the floorboards on the other side. Then she carried her trunk to the entrance hall, set it by the door, and sat down on the bench beside it to wait for first light. The house was enormous and silent around her. Through the tall windows, the sky was the deep, colorless gray that comes just before dawn begins to think about arriving. She did not think. She simply sat. She was still sitting there, coat buttoned, hands folded, when the footsteps came. Not from the servants' stairs, from the main staircase, measured and deliberate. Each step placed with the unhurried certainty of a man who was not chasing anything because he had already decided where he was going. Geraldine did not look up immediately. When she did, Lord Dunning was standing at the foot of the stairs, fully dressed. His expression was unreadable. In his left hand was her resignation letter, still folded. In his right hand was a different envelope entirely, cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been handled more than once. The hall was very quiet. "Before you go," he said, "there is something you should have been given 4 months ago." Geraldine looked at the envelope in his hand and did not reach for it. "I don't understand," she said. "I know." Dunning crossed the entrance hall and placed it on the bench beside her, not in her hand, beside her, and as though he understood that she needed a moment before she could touch it. "Dorothy brought it to Thompson last night. He came to me at midnight." Geraldine picked it up slowly. The envelope was addressed in a clean, formal hand she did not recognize. Edinburgh postmark, a legal firm she had never heard of. She looked at Dunning. "Open it," he said quietly. She did. The letter inside was dated 4 months ago. It was an offer of employment, a position as household and estate administrator for a Scottish earl, at a salary nearly double what she was currently earning, with full authority, a private apartment, and a tenure contract of 3 years guaranteed. The firm wrote that her name had been recommended by a colleague of her late brother's, who had spoken with considerable enthusiasm about her abilities. Geraldine read it through to the end. Then she read it again. "I never received this," she said. "No. I never applied for anything in Edinburgh. I have never corresponded with this firm." "No." Dunning reached into his coat and produced a second document. "This is the reply they received." She took it. The handwriting on the outside was hers, almost. The loops a fraction too neat, the pressure a fraction too even. Someone who had practiced it but had not lived inside it long enough to know where it breathed. Inside, 3 paragraphs declining the position with gracious finality, citing a change in personal circumstances, signed with her name. Geraldine sat very still. 4 months ago. The letter had been sitting in a locked drawer for 4 months. While she had been working and arguing and rewriting tenant agreements, and allowing herself, carefully and foolishly, to believe she had found somewhere worth staying. "Patricia," she said, It was not a question. Yes. The words settled in the cold entrance hall like a stone dropped into still water. And then, from somewhere above them, came the soft sound of a door opening. Footsteps on the upper landing, unhurried, composed. Patricia descended the staircase in a dressing gown of deep green wool, her hair pinned, her expression already arranged into something between concern and dignity. She took in the scene below, Geraldine on the bench, the trunk at the door, Dunning standing between them, and made the calculation in the space of 2 seconds. "My goodness," she said pleasantly. Whatever is happening at this hour?" Dunning did not turn immediately. He looked at Geraldine for one more moment, as though confirming something to himself. Then he turned. "Thompson is arriving at 8, he said. His voice was perfectly level. "You will have your belongings ready before he does." Patricia blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The letter is already in his possession." 4 words. That was all. Patricia's composure did not shatter. It was too well constructed for that. But something behind her eyes went very still, the way a flame goes still in the instant before it goes out entirely. Her hand found the banister. Behind her, Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes moving between her mother and the entrance hall below. She did not speak. She looked at Geraldine, and then she looked at the floor, and her face held the expression of someone who had suspected something for a long time and was finding no relief at all in being right. Patricia opened her mouth. Dunning said nothing further. He simply waited, with the absolute patience of a man who had already done everything that needed doing, and the silence was answer enough. Patricia closed her mouth. She looked at Geraldine once, just once, and there was nothing readable in it. Then she turned and walked back up the stairs. Melissa followed without a word. The house moved through the next several hours with quiet, efficient momentum. Trunks appeared. Carriage arrangements were made. Thompson arrived at 7:45, was shown to the study, remained there for 20 minutes, and departed with a leather case under his arm. By noon, the carriage had come and gone, and the rooms that had been Patricia's were simply rooms again, empty, orderly, holding nothing of her except the faint scent of her perfume, which the open windows would clear by evening. The house settled back into silence. Geraldine was still in the entrance hall. Her trunk was still beside the door. The Edinburgh letter was in her hands. Dunning came to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not facing her. Beside her, both of them looking at the closed front door as though they had just watched something very large pass by. "Thompson can write to the Edinburgh firm today," he said. "Explain the circumstances. They may still consider you." Geraldine was quiet for a moment. "And if I stayed?" Dunning did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer, careful and honest, and carefully honest. "Then I would ask Thompson to draft a different letter entirely." He did not look at her. "The choice has always been yours. I want you to understand that. It was yours the day you signed the contract. It is still yours now." Geraldine looked down at the Edinburgh letter. She thought about the sealed trunk behind her, and the open road outside, and the very solid, very stubborn truth that she had been running toward self-sufficiency for so long she had nearly run straight past the only place she had ever felt entirely like herself. She set the letter on the hall table. Then she picked up her trunk and turned toward the stairs. "My desk wants reorganizing," she said. "I have been meaning to do it for weeks." Behind her, she heard Dunning exhale, just once, barely audible, the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. He followed her up the stairs without a word. Later, much later, when the afternoon had softened into early evening, Geraldine sat at her desk in the estate study with the window open to the Derbyshire hills. Spring had arrived quietly while no one was paying attention. The fields below were green again, pale and tentative, and the elm tree beside the library window had come back into leaf overnight. Across the room, Dunning sat in the armchair by the empty fireplace with a letter in his hand that he had, by Geraldine's count, finished reading approximately 40 minutes ago. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. For the first time in her adult life, Geraldine Eagan was not working to justify her presence in a room. She was not being useful. She was not being careful. She was simply there, in a house that had become, without her permission and against her considerable better judgment, the first place she had ever chosen to stay. And across the room, a man who had carried her brother's books down a flight of stairs without being asked, sat pretending to read the same letter for the 5th time, and did not leave. And that, it turned out, was everything.